The harmattan wind drifted quietly across Gboko town that January morning, carrying fine red dust that settled gently on rooftops, market stalls, and the narrow roads that stretched through the busy town. Dushima Aikir stood outside her family's small compound, clutching a black nylon bag that held only a few things: a measuring tape, a small notebook, a pen, and the cheap smartphone her uncle had given her after her secondary school graduation. Her mother stood beside her, adjusting the scarf tied around her head. "Are you sure about this?" her mother asked softly. Dushima nodded. "Yes, Mama." Her father sat on a wooden bench near the doorway, watching quietly. He had not spoken much since Dushima announced her decision. Many people in their community believed that once a child finished secondary school, the next step should be university. But university required money, and the Aikir family did not have much of it. Dushima had spent weeks thinking about her future. She could sit at home waiting for admission that might take years. Or she could learn a skill immediately. And so she chose tailoring. Not because it was easy, but because she believed something important. A skill in the hand could change a life faster than empty waiting. Her mother tied the final knot on her scarf and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Be patient wherever you go," she said. "Learning is not always sweet." Dushima nodded again. "I will try my best." With that, she stepped out of the compound and began walking toward Wurukam Market, where the tailoring shop of Madame Rhoda was located. She did not know it yet, but the road she had chosen would test her strength, her pride, and her endurance in ways she had never imagined. The shop stood between a small provision store and a noisy barber shop. A faded signboard hung above the entrance. "Rhoda Fashion House. Ladies Specialist." Inside, the sound of sewing machines filled the air like a steady rhythm. 3 sewing machines hummed continuously. Fabric pieces hung from nails on the wall. Mannequins dressed in colorful ankara stood proudly in the corner. 2 apprentices bent over a cutting table while another ironed clothes with a heavy charcoal iron. At the center of it all stood Madame Rhoda. She was a tall woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her measuring tape hung around her neck like a badge of authority. She looked up as Dushima stepped in. "You are the girl that came yesterday?" "Yes, Ma," Dushima replied respectfully. Madame Rhoda studied her for a moment. "You finished secondary school?" "Yes, Ma." "And you want to learn tailoring?" "Yes, Ma." Madame Rhoda crossed her arms. "This work is not easy." "I know, Ma." "You will sweep. You will run errands. You will work long hours." "I understand, Ma." Madame Rhoda paused for a moment longer, then finally nodded. "Good. Start by sweeping the shop." Just like that, Dushima's apprenticeship began. The broom was almost taller than she was. She began sweeping slowly, careful not to disturb the fabric pieces lying around. The shop floor was covered with thread, fabric trimmings, and dust that had gathered from the busy market outside. As she swept, she listened carefully. Every sound, every instruction, every conversation. She watched how Madame Rhoda measured customers, how she spoke confidently about styles, how she cut fabric with steady precision. It fascinated Dushima. By afternoon her feet already hurt. But the work was far from over. "Go to the market and buy thread number 40, Madame Rhoda said, handing her some money. "Yes, Ma." Dushima ran out of the shop and entered the noisy market streets. Traders shouted prices from every direction. Motorcycles sped past. Customers bargained loudly. She searched carefully through the stalls until she found the correct thread. Then she ran back to the shop. She thought the errand was finished. But it was only the beginning. "Now go and buy zipper," Madame Rhoda said immediately. Dushima nodded and ran again. Before the day ended, she had visited the market 3 times. Her legs ached. Her stomach growled with hunger. But she said nothing. When evening came, she helped arrange finished clothes and fold fabric pieces neatly. By the time she finally left the shop, the sky was already dark. Her body felt exhausted. But strangely, her heart felt hopeful. She had taken the first step. The real test came 1 week later. That morning, Dushima woke up late. Her alarm had failed. By the time she reached the shop, the sun was already high. Madame Rhoda stood outside speaking to a customer. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed Dushima approaching. "You are late," she said calmly. "I'm sorry, Ma." Madame Rhoda pointed to the ground outside the shop. "Kneel there." Dushima froze. She thought she had heard wrongly. But Madame Rhoda repeated the instruction. "Kneel." Slowly, Dushima placed her knees on the dusty ground outside the shop. People passing through the market stared. Some whispered. Some laughed. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. Every minute felt like an hour. Inside the shop, the sewing machines continued humming as if nothing unusual was happening. Dushima kept her head lowered. Part of her wanted to stand up and leave. Part of her wanted to cry. But another voice inside her whispered something stronger. "If you quit now, you will never learn." So she stayed there, quietly, patiently. After nearly 30 minutes, Madame Rhoda stepped outside again. "You may stand up." Dushima rose slowly, dust clinging to her knees. "Go and sweep the shop," Madame Rhoda said simply. No apology, no explanation, just instruction. And strangely, that moment became one of the most important lessons Dushima would ever learn. Because that day she understood something powerful. Mastery requires humility. And humility sometimes begins with kneeling. That night, when Dushima returned home, her mother noticed the dust on her knees. "What happened?" she asked. Dushima hesitated for a moment. Then she smiled slightly. "I learned another lesson today." Her mother looked at her carefully. "Are you sure you want to continue?" Dushima nodded firmly. "Yes." Because despite the humiliation, the exhaustion, and the long market errands, something inside her had already begun to grow. Quiet determination. A belief that if she endured the difficult beginning, something greater might be waiting at the end. And that belief, oh small, was strong enough to carry her into the next chapter of her journey. The weeks that followed tested Dushima in ways she had never imagined. First, the routine felt manageable. Wake up early, help her mother fetch water, eat whatever little breakfast was available, and hurry to Madame Rhoda's shop at Wurika Market before the sun climbed too high. But as time passed, the reality of apprenticeship revealed itself. Learning tailoring was not simply about sitting behind a sewing machine and creating beautiful clothes. It was about endurance. And endurance, Dushima quickly discovered, came at a cost. Every morning when she arrived at the shop, she was the first apprentice expected to begin work. The broom would already be leaning against the wall waiting for her. Without being told, she would sweep the entire shop floor, carefully gathering threads, fabric scraps, dust from the road, and tiny pieces of interfacing that customers had left behind. After sweeping, she wiped the cutting table clean. Then she arranged the chairs for customers. Then she dusted the mannequins. Sometimes she barely finished before Madame Rhoda arrived. And once Madame Rhoda stepped into the shop, the day officially began. "Dushima," Madame Rhoda would call. "Yes, Ma." "Go to the market. Buy lining." Before she returned, another instruction would come. "Buy elastic." Then again. "Get thread." And sometimes again. "Go and find black zipper." The market traders soon began recognizing her. "Ah, the tailor girl," one trader would shout as she approached. "You have come again today." Dushima would smile politely. "Yes, auntie." Sometimes she ran so much that her slippers nearly broke. But she continued. Because each errand, no matter how tiring, was slowly teaching her something important. She learned which shop sold the best thread, which trader cheated customers, which fabrics faded quickly after washing, which linings lasted longer. The market itself was becoming her second classroom. Food, however, remained a struggle. Apprentices did not earn salaries. And Dushima's parents could only give her small money occasionally. At first she tried enduring hunger throughout the day. But soon the hunger became too much. Her body needed energy to run errands and work long hours. So one afternoon she stopped at a roadside stall and bought something simple. A small nylon of Garri. That day she carried it carefully back to the shop and hid it inside her bag. Whenever hunger came, she would quietly pour some into a plastic cup, add water and drink. No sugar. No ground nuts. Just plain Garri and water. It was not satisfying. But it was enough to keep her going. Soon it became her daily routine. The Garri stayed inside the shop. Hidden. Reliable. A silent companion during difficult days. Evenings were often the hardest part of the day. As the market began closing, other apprentices from nearby shops usually packed their things and left. But Madame Rhoda's shop rarely closed early. Customers often came late from work, bringing fabrics and requesting urgent sewing. And when urgent orders arrived, everyone in the shop had to stay. Dushima did not complain. She helped fold fabrics. She arranged threads. She ironed finished clothes with a heavy charcoal iron that left heat burning through her palms. Sometimes she remained in the shop until nearly 9 p.m. The road home would be dark, the market quiet. But strangely, those late evenings also became moments when she learned the most. Because when customers were gone and the shop was calm, Madame Rhoda often began sewing the more complicated styles. And Dushima watched, carefully, silently. She studied every movement. How Madame Rhoda shaped sleeves. How she aligned darts. How she adjusted waist measurements. It fascinated her. But even with all that knowledge, Dushima knew something. Fashion was changing. New styles were appearing. And many of those styles were not yet common in their town. That was when her secret teacher appeared. Her phone. It was not an expensive phone. The screen had a small crack near the corner. The battery drained quickly. But it had internet access. And that changed everything. Late at night, when she returned home and everyone else was asleep, Dushima would sit quietly on her bed. She would buy the smallest amount of mobile data she could afford. Then she would begin searching. Fashion tutorials. Sewing techniques. Dress designs from Lagos designers. Corset styles. Structured gowns. Sleeve patterns she had never seen before. She watched carefully. Paused videos. Replayed sections. Studied each step. Sometimes she even sketched the designs inside the small notebook she carried everywhere. Her notebook slowly filled with drawings of gowns, sleeves, skirts, and bodices. Some of the designs looked far more modern than anything customers were bringing to Madame Rhoda's shop. But Dushima did not rush. She understood something important. Learning was like planting seeds. You plant first. You harvest later. One evening something unexpected happened. A customer walked into the shop holding a printed photo. She placed the photo on the cutting table. "I want this style." Madame Rhoda studied it carefully. The design was complicated. A fitted corset dress with layered sleeves and structured waistlines. Madame Rhoda frowned slightly. "This style is not easy," she said. The customer insisted. "I saw it online. My cousin wore it in Abuja." Madame Rhoda nodded slowly. "Leave the fabric. I will try." The customer left. But when Madame Rhoda stepped outside to answer a phone call, Dushima quietly looked at the picture again. Her heart beat faster. She had seen that exact design in a tutorial video only 2 weeks earlier. She remembered every step. But she said nothing. It was not yet her place to speak. Instead, she returned to ironing clothes. Yet inside her mind something powerful stirred. For the first time she realized something important. Her phone was not just entertainment. It was expanding her knowledge beyond the walls of the shop. And knowledge, she knew, could change everything. Another turning point came during one particularly busy festive season. Christmas orders flooded the shop. Customers arrived daily with fabrics for weddings, church celebrations, and end-of-year parties. Madame Rhoda barely slept. Neither did the apprentices. One night the workload became so overwhelming that Madame Rhoda sighed deeply. "There is too much work," she muttered. The other apprentices looked exhausted. One by one they left early. But Dushima remained. "I can help, Ma," she said quietly. Madame Rhoda looked surprised. You will stay? Yes, Ma. That night they worked together for hours. Cutting, stitching, ironing, arranging clothes. By midnight, Dushima's eyes were heavy with sleep. Madame Rhoda finally looked up from her sewing machine. You can sleep on that bench. Dushima lay down on the wooden bench inside the shop. It was not comfortable, but she slept deeply. And when morning came, she woke before everyone else and began sweeping the shop again. Madame Rhoda watched her silently. Something about the girl was beginning to stand out. Not just obedience, not just endurance, but something deeper. Commitment. From that day onward, Madame Rhoda began paying closer attention to Dushima. She noticed how the girl watched every sewing technique carefully, how she asked thoughtful questions, how she never complained about market errands, how she stayed late without being forced. One afternoon Madame Rhoda said something unusual. Dushima. Yes, Ma. Come here. She handed her a piece of fabric. Practice sewing straight lines. It was a small instruction, but for Dushima it felt like receiving a key, because it meant Madame Rhoda was finally allowing her closer to the sewing machine. Her hands trembled slightly as she guided the fabric under the needle. The stitches were not perfect. Some lines curved slightly, but she kept trying, again, and again, and again, because she understood something that many people overlooked. Great skill is rarely built in moments of glory. It is built in quiet repetitions nobody celebrates. That evening, as she closed the shop with Madame Rhoda, Dushima walked home slowly through the market streets. Her feet were tired, her stomach still empty, but her heart felt strangely full. Because for the first time since she began the apprenticeship, she sensed something changing. The humiliation, the hunger, the long errands, the sleepless nights. None of it was wasted. Every struggle was shaping her, preparing her, strengthening her. And though the future was still uncertain, Dushima now understood something powerful. The road to mastery was never smooth. But those who endured its rough beginning often discovered something extraordinary waiting at the end. And deep inside her heart, a quiet voice whispered, "Your time will come." By the time Dushima had spent nearly a year in Madame Rhoda's tailoring shop at Wuruka Market, something about her had begun to change. The shy girl who once stood nervously at the shop entrance on her first day had slowly transformed into someone tougher. Her hands had grown stronger from cutting fabric and handling heavy irons. Her legs had become used to the constant trips to the market. Her mind had become sharper from watching, listening, and learning every day. But even with all that progress, Dushima understood something very clearly. She still had so much to learn. One afternoon, the shop was unusually quiet. Most customers had not yet arrived, and the other apprentices were chatting softly near the doorway. Madame Rhoda sat behind the sewing machine, adjusting a blouse she had been working on. Dushima stood nearby arranging threads on the shelf when Madame Rhoda suddenly spoke. Dushima. Yes, Ma. Bring that fabric. She pointed to a folded piece of ankara on the cutting table. Dushima walked over and carried it carefully. Madame Rhoda spread the fabric across the table and picked up her chalk. Watch closely. Dushima leaned forward. Madame Rhoda began drawing lines across the fabric with precise movements. This is how you cut a basic blouse pattern, she explained. Her voice was calm but firm. Measurements must be exact. If you make a mistake here, the entire dress will spoil. Dushima nodded slowly. Her eyes followed every movement of the chalk. Madame Rhoda finished marking the pattern and then handed the scissors to Dushima. Cut it. For a moment Dushima hesitated. The scissors felt heavy in her hand. Fabric cutting was serious work. One wrong move could destroy a customer's material. But Madame Rhoda waited silently. So Dushima took a deep breath and began cutting along the chalk lines. Slowly, carefully. Her hands trembled slightly, but she stayed focused. When she finished, Madame Rhoda examined the pieces. She said nothing for several seconds. Then she nodded. Good. That single word filled Dushima with a quiet excitement she could hardly describe. It was the first time Madame Rhoda had trusted her with something so important. And it meant she was slowly moving from errand girl to real apprentice. That evening, when Dushima returned home, she could not stop thinking about the moment. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching what she remembered. The pattern lines, the measurements, the shapes of the cut fabric. Then she opened her phone and searched again for sewing tutorials. This time she watched videos specifically about pattern drafting. Some of the techniques were similar to what Madame Rhoda had shown her. Others were completely new. The world of fashion suddenly felt much larger than the small shop at Wuricum Market. Designers across different countries were experimenting with bold shapes and modern techniques. Some dresses looked like works of art. And each night, Dushima studied them carefully. The phone that once served only for calls had become her private fashion school. Meanwhile, life at the shop continued its demanding rhythm. The errands never stopped. The market runs continued. But something else began happening. Customers started noticing Dushima, not because she spoke loudly, but because of how she behaved. Whenever a customer arrived, she greeted them politely. She helped arrange their fabrics. She listened carefully when they explained the styles they wanted. Her quiet respect made people comfortable. One afternoon, a middle-aged woman walked into the shop holding a bright lace fabric. She sat down and began explaining the dress she wanted. Dushima listened closely. The woman struggled to describe the sleeve design. Finally she sighed. "I saw it somewhere, but I cannot explain it well." Madame Rhoda looked confused. Then Dushima spoke carefully. "Ma, do you mean a butterfly sleeve?" The woman's face lit up. "Yes, that's the name." Madame Rhoda glanced at Dushima briefly. "How do you know that?" Dushima hesitated. "I saw it online, Ma." Madame Rhoda said nothing more. But the look in her eyes changed slightly. For the first time, she began realizing that the young apprentice might be learning things beyond what the shop was teaching. Another turning point came during one particularly busy week. Several wedding orders had arrived at the same time. The shop was filled with fabrics, measurement books, and half-finished dresses. Everyone was working under pressure. One afternoon Madame Rhoda asked one of the older apprentices to sew a sleeve for a customer's gown. The apprentice tried. But the sleeve refused to sit properly. He tried again. Still wrong. Madame Rhoda frowned. "This sleeve is not correct." The apprentice sighed in frustration. "Madam, I've tried twice." Madame Rhoda picked up the sleeve and examined it. Then she looked around the shop. Her eyes stopped on Dushima. "Come here." Dushima stepped forward. "Look at this sleeve," Madame Rhoda said. "Tell me what is wrong." Dushima studied it carefully. She remembered watching a similar sleeve tutorial a few days earlier. The problem was small but important. "The curve is too tight here," she said quietly, pointing to the armhole. Madame Rhoda looked again. She adjusted the fabric slightly. Then she nodded. She turned to the older apprentice. "Adjust it the way she said." The apprentice looked slightly embarrassed but followed the instruction. When the sleeve was fixed, it fit perfectly. Madame Rhoda said nothing more. But from that day, she began giving Dushima more attention during sewing lessons. Despite these small victories, Dushima's life remained difficult. The Garri in the shop was still her daily companion. Some days she wished she could eat something better. But she reminded herself why she started. Her goal was not comfort. Her goal was growth. There were also moments when discouragement crept in. Sometimes she compared herself to designers she saw online. Their studios looked beautiful. Their machines were modern. Their fabrics were luxurious. Meanwhile, she was still an apprentice sweeping floors. But whenever those thoughts came, she pushed them aside. Every expert had once been a beginner. And every master had once practiced in small rooms like this one. One evening something unexpected happened. Madame Rhoda returned from the market carrying a fashion magazine. It contained pictures of modern African fashion designs. She placed it on the cutting table. "This is what customers are beginning to ask for," she said. The apprentices gathered around. Dushima's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. Corset gowns, structured sleeves, elegant evening dresses. Some of the styles were exactly like the tutorials she had been studying on her phone. For the first time she realized something exciting. The knowledge she had been secretly gathering was not useless. It was preparing her for the future of fashion. That night as she walked home through the quiet streets of Boko, Dushima felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. Her feet were sore. Her stomach was empty again. But her mind was alive with ideas. She imagined the kinds of dresses she might sew one day, the types of customers she might serve, the studio she might eventually own. But she also knew something important. Dreams alone were not enough. They required discipline. They required sacrifice. And most importantly, they required time. So she continued walking through the dimly lit road toward her family's compound. Above her, the night sky stretched wide and silent. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing inside her heart was becoming clearer every day. She was no longer just a girl learning tailoring. She was slowly becoming something greater, a designer in the making. And the lessons she was learning through hardship, patience, and relentless curiosity were quietly shaping the person she would one day become. The road ahead was still long, but Dushima was ready to walk it, one stitch at a time. By the second year of Dushima's apprenticeship, life at Madame Rhoda's shop in Wurika Market had become a rhythm she knew by heart. The early morning sweeping, the endless errands to the market, the long evenings ironing clothes, the nights she sometimes slept on the narrow wooden bench inside the shop. None of it felt new anymore. Hard, yes, but familiar. Yet something else had changed too. Dushima was no longer just observing. She was understanding. Every time Madame Rhoda cut fabric, Dushima could now predict the next step. When a customer described a style, she could already imagine the pattern pieces in her mind. And when problems appeared during sewing, she often knew where the mistake had been made. Her knowledge had grown quietly, not through praise, not through special training, but through hundreds of hours of watching, practicing, and studying late at night with her phone. One afternoon, the shop was busier than usual. Several customers had arrived at the same time, bringing fabrics for upcoming weddings and church programs. Colorful ankara and lace fabrics filled the cutting table. Measurements were being taken. Threads rolled across the floor. The entire shop buzzed with activity. In the middle of the noise, a well-dressed woman walked in carrying an expensive fabric. Her perfume filled the room as she sat down. "I need a dress for my sister's wedding," she said confidently. Madame Rhoda smiled politely. "What style would you like?" The woman brought out her phone and showed a picture. It was a corset lace gown with structured sleeves and detailed waist shaping. Madame Rhoda studied the picture carefully. Her expression changed slightly. The design was complicated. Very complicated. She turned the phone sideways, examining every detail. Then she sighed quietly. "This style will require careful work," she said. "I understand," the woman replied. "But I want exactly this." Madame Rhoda nodded slowly. "Leave the fabric. Come back in 2 weeks." The woman agreed, leaving behind several yards of beautiful lace and lining. Once she left the shop, Madame Rhoda remained staring at the picture for several seconds. The other apprentices noticed her hesitation. "This style is not common here," one of them whispered. Madame Rhoda folded the fabric slowly. But Dushima stood silently in the corner, watching. Her heart beat faster, because she recognized the design instantly. It was a structured corset gown she had studied repeatedly in one of the fashion tutorials on her phone. She remembered the video clearly. The designer had explained every step. But speaking up felt dangerous. She was still an apprentice. And apprentices were not expected to correct their madam. So she kept quiet. 2 days later, Madame Rhoda began working on the dress. She cut the fabric carefully, prepared the lining, then started assembling the bodice. First everything went smoothly. But when she tried shaping the corset structure, something refused to sit properly. She adjusted the seams. Tried again. Still wrong. The bodice looked slightly uneven. Madame Rhoda frowned. "This corset is not sitting well," she murmured. The other apprentices gathered around. One suggested adjusting the darts. Another suggested loosening the lining. But none of the adjustments worked. The dress still looked slightly distorted. Madame Rhoda sighed in frustration. "This design is troublesome." Dushima stood quietly nearby. Her heart pounded. She knew what the problem was. The video she watched had explained that boning support was necessary for the corset structure to sit correctly. Without it, the fabric would collapse. But how could she say it? Minutes passed. Finally, courage rose inside her. "Madam," she said softly. Madame Rhoda turned. "Yes." Dushima swallowed nervously. "I think the corset needs support inside. Something like boning." The shop became quiet. The other apprentices looked at her with surprise. Madame Rhoda stared at her. "How do you know that?" Dushima hesitated. "I saw it in a tutorial video." Madame Rhoda studied her face carefully. Then she looked again at the dress. She thought for a moment. Finally she nodded slowly. She opened one of the drawers and pulled out thin plastic boning strips used for structured garments. "Let's try it." They inserted the boning carefully inside the corset seams. Then Madame Rhoda adjusted the stitching and pressed the fabric flat with the iron. When the bodice was placed back on the mannequin, the difference was immediate. The corset stood perfectly. The waistline curved beautifully. The structure looked elegant. The apprentices gasped quietly. Madame Rhoda remained silent for a few seconds. Then she looked at Dushima again. "You learned that from your phone?" "Yes, ma." Madame Rhoda nodded slowly. "Good observation." Those two words felt heavier than any praise Dushima had ever received. The dress was completed 3 days later. When the customer returned for fitting, the entire shop watched. She stepped behind the curtain and changed. Moments later she emerged wearing the gown. Everyone stared. The corset hugged her waist perfectly. The lace sleeves flowed elegantly over her shoulders. The dress looked exactly like the picture she had brought. The woman's eyes widened in the mirror. "This is beautiful." She turned around several times admiring the dress. "I love it." Madame Rhoda smiled proudly. But before the customer left, she asked something unexpected. "Who helped make this corset?" Madame Rhoda looked briefly at Dushima. Then she replied calmly. "My apprentice assisted." The woman turned to Dushima. "You did well." Dushima smiled shyly. "Thank you, ma." That evening, after the shop closed, Madame Rhoda sat quietly at the cutting table. The other apprentices had already left. Only Dushima remained, folding fabric pieces. Madame Rhoda watched her for a moment. "You study a lot with that phone, don't you?" "Yes, ma." Madame Rhoda nodded thoughtfully. "Continue learning." Then she added something that surprised Dushima. "Fashion is changing. A good designer must keep learning." Dushima felt warmth spread through her chest. For the first time since she started the apprenticeship, she felt truly seen. Not just as the girl who ran errands. Not just as the girl who swept floors. But as someone with potential. That night as Dushima walked home through the quiet streets of Boko, the cool air brushed gently against her face. Her feet were still tired. Her stomach was still empty. But her heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. Because she had learned something important that day. All the nights she spent studying with her phone. All the hunger she endured while drinking Garri. All the patience she showed during difficult days. None of it had been wasted. Every sacrifice had been preparing her for moments like this. Moments where knowledge meets opportunity. And when those two meet, everything can change. Dushima did not know exactly what the future held. But she now believed something with absolute certainty. Her journey was only beginning. And somewhere ahead, beyond the small tailoring shop at Wurika Market, a bigger story was waiting to unfold. Time has a quiet way of revealing the value of perseverance. For Dushima, the years that followed her moment of discovery in Madame Rhoda's shop moved both slowly and quickly at the same time. Slowly because every day still demanded hard work. Quickly because each passing month carried her closer to mastery. By the third year of her apprenticeship, the shop at Wuricum Market felt almost like a second home. She knew the sound of every sewing machine. She knew which drawer held the zippers and which box contained the delicate lace needles. She knew the traders in the market by name and could tell, just by touching a fabric, whether it was good quality or not. But the most important change was something deeper. Dushima was no longer simply enduring the work. She was growing through it. Customers had begun to notice her more often. At first, they only saw her as the quiet apprentice who helped carry fabrics and arrange chairs. But gradually they began asking questions. Who cut this sleeve? Who fixed this neckline? Sometimes Madame Rhoda would answer casually. My apprentice assisted. Other times she simply smiled and said nothing. But inside the shop, the other apprentices had begun to see it clearly. Dushima was becoming one of the strongest learners Madame Rhoda had ever trained. Her hunger to learn never stopped. Even after long days of work, she still returned home and opened her phone to study new sewing techniques. Corset structures, modern sleeve designs, skirt draping styles. Each video expanded her imagination. Each lesson added another tool to her growing skill. And slowly, Madame Rhoda began giving her more responsibility. One afternoon something unusual happened. Madame Rhoda stepped out to attend a meeting with a fabric supplier. Before leaving, she turned to the apprentices. I will be gone for 2 hours. She looked directly at Dushima. If any customer comes, take their measurements. The word surprised everyone in the shop. Taking measurements was serious work. It required accuracy, confidence, responsibility. Dushima nodded respectfully. Yes, ma. After Madame Rhoda left, the shop grew quiet. About 30 minutes later, a young woman entered carrying a bundle of Ankara fabric. Good afternoon, she greeted. Good afternoon, ma, Dushima replied politely. I came to sew a dress for my birthday. Dushima smiled and guided her to the chair. Please sit. Her hands moved carefully as she wrapped the measuring tape around the woman's shoulders. Bust, waist, hip, shoulder, armhole. She wrote each measurement neatly inside the shop's measurement book. Then she asked gently, what style would you like? The woman described a fitted gown with layered sleeves. Dushima listened carefully. She even suggested a small adjustment to improve the sleeve balance. The customer nodded excitedly. That will look beautiful. When Madame Rhoda returned later and reviewed the measurements, she simply nodded. Good. For Dushima, that single word meant everything. It was another step forward. Yet even as her skills improved, Dushima never forgot the difficult days that had shaped her journey. The memories remained vivid. The afternoons she drank plain Garri and water to quiet her hunger. The long walks to the market under the burning sun. The humiliation of kneeling outside the shop for arriving late. Those moments had once felt painful. But now she saw them differently. They had been training. Training for discipline. Training for patience. Training for the kind of character success requires. Then one evening, something happened that Dushima would never forget. It was nearly closing time when Madame Rhoda called everyone together. I have an announcement, she said. The apprentices stopped working and gathered around the cutting table. Madame Rhoda looked directly at Dushima. You have completed your training. For a moment, Dushima thought she had heard wrongly. The words echoed in her mind. Completed your training. Her chest tightened with emotion. Apprenticeship graduation was a significant moment. It meant she was no longer a learner. She was now a trained tailor. The other apprentices smiled and congratulated her. Madame Rhoda continued speaking. You came here as a girl who knew nothing about tailoring. Pause. But you endured every challenge. You worked harder than most apprentices I have trained. Her voice softened slightly. And you never stopped learning. Dushima lowered her head respectfully. "Thank you, Ma." Madame Rhoda reached into a small cabinet and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. Inside was a brand new measuring tape and a pair of tailoring scissors. "These are for you," Madame Rhoda said. "Every tailor needs her own tools." Dushima accepted them with trembling hands. For years she had borrowed tools. Now she owned her own. It felt like holding the beginning of a new life. The graduation ceremony took place a week later. Friends, neighbors, and family members gathered outside the shop. Music played softly from a speaker. Food was shared. Dushima's parents sat proudly among the guests. Her mother wiped tears quietly as she watched her daughter. Her father simply smiled. The shy girl who once left home uncertain about her future had now completed a professional skill. When it was time to speak, Madame Rhoda stood before the crowd. "Success is not always about talent," she said. "Sometimes it is about endurance." She looked at Dushima. This girl endured. Applause filled the air. But Dushima remained humble. Because she knew the journey was not finished. Graduation was only the beginning. A few months later, Dushima rented a small space not far from the market. It was not a large shop. Just enough room for 2 sewing machines, a cutting table, and a mannequin. She hung a modest signboard outside. "Dushima Designs." The first few weeks were slow. Just like when she began her apprenticeship years earlier. But she did not panic. She understood something now that she had not known before. Success grows gradually, like stitches forming a garment. Customer by customer, her reputation began to grow. People who had seen her work at Madame Rhoda's shop came to sew with her. Friends recommended her to others. Soon her small shop began filling with fabrics and orders. And each time she guided fabric under her sewing machine, she remembered the long road that brought her there. The Garri errands, the sleepless nights, the discipline. Years later, as Dushima stood inside her now larger fashion studio, she sometimes told young apprentices her story. They would sit around her cutting table, listening carefully. "Success is not magic," she would say. "It is patience." She would point to her scissors. These tools came after years of endurance. Then she would smile and add something she had learned from her own journey. Never be ashamed of small beginnings. Because inside those humble beginnings often lies the strength that builds extraordinary futures. Dushima's story teaches something powerful. Greatness is rarely born in comfort. It grows through discipline, sacrifice, humility, and the willingness to learn even when life is difficult. Many people quit when the road becomes hard. But those who endure long enough often discover that the very struggles they hated were secretly preparing them for their success. Because sometimes the difference between failure and greatness is simply this: the courage to keep going when nobody is watching. Thank you for watching. Tell us where you are watching from, what you think of this story. Don't forget to hit on the notification button to get notified when we drop a new video. Thank you for your support.